Aloha mai kako, everyone. Let me announce our wonderful guest tonight. I'm super excited. I have learned so much from Keawe, and I'm really honored that he agreed to come onto the to podcast and share with us his mana'o and his just deep knowledge of not just Hawaiian history, but Indigenous history. So Adam Keawe Manalo Camp is a native Hawaiian cultural historian with roots in both Papakolea Homestead and in the Philippines. He's also a writer, blogger, and researcher who writes from a Hawaiian point of view and perspective, which is valued and treasured by so many in our community. So let us bring him on and welcome him to the show. Aloha.
Aloha.
Mahalo nui for being here with us tonight. Let's get started with we typically like to go to the piku or your origins. And can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where did you grow up and what was your childhood like?
Well, I grew up in Papakolea, Hawaiian Homestead, on the island of Oahu. However, my family is originally from the island of Hawaii, particularly from Hamakua, Kohala, and Kona. My I was brought up by my grandmother. My grandmother was born in 1900, so she was just an utter wealth of knowledge.
Yes.
And I went to public school all the way. Um, Contrary to what some people have been saying, I did not go to Kamehameha schools. I went to Lincoln, Stevenson, Roosevelt. So, yeah, I'm a product of public school. So, as far as my childhood, well, my as I mentioned, I was brought up by my grandmother. In the household, Hawaiian was the primary language. However, when I had to go to school and anywhere outside the house, of course, English was the language that was used. And I actually still have a lot of trauma about that. Like, I still remember the first day of kindergarten where I was in a classroom with a bunch of kids and I could not understand them. And my teacher gave up on trying to communicate with me and she sent me home. And then the school decided that I needed to go to English as a second language class. And I was in ESL for 4 years. And as a result of how much I hated ESL class, I lost a lot of my Hawaiian language skills growing up because of that, because I was trying to fit in and I was trying to accommodate being the outside world, school, and also that's how it was for a lot of kids, where English was you had to learn the colonial language. And my grandmother had much worse experiences than I. My mother had worse experiences than I. My grandmother was beaten for speaking Hawaiian. She had a scar on her left hand from a teacher that she had in the third grade because she was caught speaking Hawaiian. And the teacher gave her a whooping with a metric ruler, and it hit her hand so hard that even though when she passed away at 93 years old, she still had the scar left on her left hand by her teacher for speaking in her native language in her native homeland. And I think about these experiences of my grandmother, my mother, and myself. And I am glad that the younger generation has experience now to be able to be Hawaiian in their own homeland or try to be Hawaiian in their own homeland. Because the reality is in Hawaii, a Hawaiian can be an engineer, a doctor, a teacher, professor. But the only thing that a Hawaiian cannot truly be is Hawaiian.
I was already thinking about like as you were saying that, I was like, yep, the only thing we cannot be is Hawaiian. And I'm glad that you mentioned how you know, our ancestors were treated and beaten for speaking our native language. And it's like a generational trauma that a lot of us experience, but may not have known what it really was, right? We don't have the terms that we even have. So mahalo nui for sharing that. I know it's tough to talk about these things too.
Yes, definitely. And of course, within the Hawaiian community, we have a deep appreciation and respect for a kupuna. Puna. Can you tell us about someone who has the biggest influence in your life and what lessons did that person teach you?
Do you mean within my family or outside?
It could be either. Yeah.
Oh, everyone.
Uh, the person who had the biggest impact on me is actually my grandmother who raised me because I think about all of the struggles that she went through.
Mhm.
She was born in
Yes.
1900. She attended Queen Liliuokalani's funeral. She saw Hawaii develop from the territory until the state. Uh,
Hmm.
the year that she died, there was the Unipa'a March at Iolani Palace, marking the 100th anniversary of the overthrow, the illegal overthrow, excuse me. And being a woman of color, growing up during that climate, I cannot fathom how much she had to go through. And she was by profession a nurse, and she went to actually for nursing. She was one of the few Hawaiians at the time who graduated from, and yeah, and she cared for people, and she never, despite the obstacles that she had faced, she never gave up on being Hawaiian. And that's probably something that I take with me because whenever I go through whenever I'm struggling with something, I just think about the strength that I have inherited
Yeah.
from my grandparents.
Oh, I love that so much. You're definitely echoing the way I view the strength of my kupuna as well. And I often think like when we are dealing with the challenges, it's actually a kuleana to like not let those things bog us down because it's a way for us to pay respect and honor to them continuously and continue on their legacy and the things that they wanted for us. So, wow. When you said like 1900, I was like, oh man. So she was like right in the midst of everything that was pivotal to that. Well, like you said, the illegal overthrow and how the landscape of Hawaii changed throughout her lifetime. What a blessing to
Yeah.
have her.
But she also had a lot of, like many Hawaiians, she also had a lot of trauma from that.
Yes.
Her father was imprisoned by the Republic of Hawaii for participating in the 1895 uprising.
Mhm.
Her mother was wrongfully sent to Molokai, where she caught leprosy because they misdiagnosed her. But like her father, I read through his letters. So my father is the grandson. Her father was the grandson of George Lipo, who was a legislator in the Hawaiian Kingdom for 20 years. His son became secretary to Princess Ruth in
Mhm.
Nikolani.
Mhm.
So there's those connections. And as mentioned, I think in the National Geographic article, my family is connected one way or another, either through employment or through station to Iolani Palace for the last 5 generations. So my grandmother's mother was actually a lady in waiting in 1892, right when the queen was going through everything, the whole mess, right before the overthrow. So the overthrow for them, just like many other Hawaiians, was deeply personal. And it
Mhm.
wasn't just some sort of abstract political, it was deeply personal, it was spiritual, it was also economic. My family lost a lot of lands due to quiet titling and eminent domain during the territorial era because that was happening to Hawaiians. Yeah. So I as like other indigenous people, we have as Native Hawaiians gone through so much. And we also need to remember that our ancestors suffered, but they suffered in the hopes that we could rebuild what they had lost.
Yes.
Yes, that's a great point. And I love the theme that I'm hearing here are the wonderful women in Hawaiian culture who played such important roles in our daily life and within our culture. And in a lot of the conversations around diversity today, there's a lot of talk about seeking equality for women because historically, the patriarchal society of the United States has too often limited women's rights and views. Um, but on the flip side, when you look at the different indigenous cultures around the world, women, as you mentioned, have held critical roles in the culture. And in your research that you share with us, you celebrate many of the matriarchs in Pacific Islander society. Can you share with our audience a bit about this and who are some of your favorite women leaders, role models, and why?
So sometimes as Hawaiians, we're obsessed with the li'i structure,
Mm,
which is predominantly written by the history is written by men who were part of that structure. You
mhm,
don't actually know a lot about the history of the Makaaina na, the common people, as most of the common people were wiped away with the foreign diseases that swept upon the lands in the early part of the 19th century. And the structure of these Makaaina na were very much centered on women. And even within the li'i structure itself, the only hereditary titles that existed through a matrilineal, through the matriarchal line. Men's titles could be fought over, be divested, could be invested, but the titles held by women were passed on. Um, because they're as women, as wahine, they hold both the past and the future. And I think sometimes in the way, because we have been so influenced by colonization,
Yeah.
we leave out a lot of these informations concerning women and their role and how they fit into Hawaiian society, both pre contact and today. And as I think I mentioned several times in some of my posts, women in Hawaiian history are usually the catalyst for change. So on one hand, they are the makers of change, but on the other hand, they also hold tradition. And to a Western mind, that might sound contradictory, but it's not in the Hawaiian mind. Because if you know your traditions very well, you'll understand that there's some traditions that do need to change and that there is room and space for change within tradition. So there's that. As far as women that I admire, there's a lot. But I think one of the political figures that I admire is Emma Nabahi, who was a journalist. She was a editor. She was, of course, the wife of Joseph Nabahi. But also, she was politically active throughout her life. And people skip over what happened to her after 1897. But even after 1897, she was still going strong all the way to the 1930s. She helped to organize labor unions. She joined in strikes against the sugar planters. She helped to organize FDR's visit to Hawaii. And it was largely because of her criticisms that FDR pushed for the restoration of Iolani Palace. Of course, that didn't actually happen. They restored one room, the throne room. It didn't. It took another, what, 40 years before the palace would be restored, which that set into motion preservation of the palace. She also was deeply Hawaiian and centered herself within something that she had a drive to be Hawaiian. At the same time, she also had a drive to learn things from the outside world. Like she was also fluent in Chinese and she was an avid book reader. She read huge amounts of books from different subjects. So she was very akamai in her own right. And one of the touching stories I think about too is when her husband was on his deathbed in San Francisco because he had contracted TB from being imprisoned. His last words to his wife was that he just kept on apologizing to her for forcing her to come so far away from her homeland and how he admired her dedication to Hawaii and how sorry he was that he was going to probably die so far away from the land that she had loved and that they had loved.
Oh, that's hearing that story. Oh my gosh. Okay. Definitely. When you go in Hawaiian culture, our view of gender roles is unique and accepting. Particularly, we have the concept of Mahu, which is someone who is in the middle. Kumu and Hina did a great documentary called A Place in the Middle that we thoroughly enjoyed. Can you share with us a bit about the importance of Mahu and the cultural and spiritual value it has?
So, Mapu can mean many things. It can mean someone who's gay, homosexual. It can mean someone who is transgender. It can mean someone who is more pansexual. There's a lot of definitions that is possible within the context of Mahu. And what that does is it creates a unique space for people who are Mahu. Like I consider myself to be Mahu, to be able to go between spaces that were designed for Kane and spaces that were designed for Wahine. At the same time, it speaks to our ancestors, not seeing gender roles or gender itself as necessarily being binary. I personally think of Mapu as being more of a gender unto itself, as a third gender,
Mhm.
so much being as somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
But I understand that point of view. With that comes a certain kuleana. And what I mean by that is that I understand that people say that is a spiritual role. And I agree with that. But at the same time, we need to also look at it from a cultural perspective, which is that Mapu were able to preserve traditions from the Vahine and the men. And they were also able to provoke thought about the binary identities and about sexuality itself.
I've often found that as a child, Mahu, at least the way it was explained to me, right, and not having the full Hawaiian cultural perspective,
Yeah.
but was more like along the gay lines and not necessarily from the cultural perspective in terms of like bridging, being able to bridge. For me, I feel like it's, I don't know, like affinity in a way, like, because there are times like I don't consider myself Mahu, but I do feel that there are spaces that I generally like tend to go to more masculine spaces, like in terms of like who I surround myself with. And I don't know where that comes from. It's just natural to me, like
Yeah.
to be this project the strength part, like being a champion for the people, like many of our Wahine, right, in our culture. So I'm really glad we got to get your perspective on that
Yeah.
because I think it's not a simple concept at all.
Exactly, 'cause I love the fact you brought that up, Moana, because I know not only for the Hawaiian portion, but I know for my grandmother from the Native American perspective, it has that similar,
Mhm.
connection, which I learned growing up, that it's considered fluidity, that gender is a social construct that was put on us by colonization,
Yes.
but, both the Native Hawaiians and Native Americans considered it more fluid in our approach and who we are, and I'd always consider it as a fluidity and all that we get some of us have like was said, a little bit of both areas, or some may lean more towards one, lean towards another, but it's that fluidness that we flow between the energies of both spectrums.
Now, regardless of how we individually or collectively view ourselves from a gender perspective, we still find that because of the way we've been brought up, at least we've observed across many indigenous cultures that we're taught to be humble and not necessarily speak up about the things that we have or how we may feel about an issue or telling our own story. And for a lot of us, it's taking some time to find our voices and be brave enough to use them.
Yeah.
So, when, Keawe, do you think that this happened for you? And what advice would you offer to those who are still not comfortable speaking out and advocating for themselves or others?
Well, I think that's a struggle because sometimes, even if you are Ma'a or familiar with Hawaiian culture, there are areas where you have to really think if it's really Hawaiian culture or if it's a throwback to the missionaries, essentially. And like for example, I heard you speaking about strength and about women speaking out and stuff like that. That is a very traditional Hawaiian role for women. Um, but in the West, of course, women are expected to be subservient, smile, bear children. But in the Hawaiian perspective, that is not necessarily the case. Women, for example, had multiple partners, both male and female. Women could hold political power in their own right. And several Hawaiian women prior to Kamehameha the First were basically the li'inui of their island. Oahu, for example, has had three female ali'i nui. So, yes, colonization really screwed us up and screwed up particularly the role of women. Because again, you look at Kamehameha the First, he passed away and uh, Ka'ahumanu becomes Kushina Nui, and his son Liho becomes Kamehameha the Second. But when it was announced that they would share power, no one said anything about Ka'ahumanu's gender. There was no concern about that. And in fact, it was seen as being relatively reasonable because Liho was so young and Kahumanu was political machine in her own right. So again, when we're talking about the role of women, Hawaiian women in particular, we need to also clarify that women were the artists, women were the activists, women were the connection between the land and the people. So I don't necessarily see female activists as being something that is culturally incorrect. To me, that is very much a part of our culture.
Yeah.
Women have to they need to speak out
Mhm.
because they're the ones who straighten up the lahui.
Mhm.
Right.
So, as far as advice for speaking out, I think one has to figure out what their kuleana is.
Mm.
What is the thing that motivates you? What is what are the issues that really wrench your gut? And then you have to figure out what is the appropriate role that you feel that you can get into. Because not everyone has to be a person who organizes a rally.
Mhm.
Rallies are good, but not everyone has that type of skill.
Yes.
Some people, their skill is to make posters for the rally. Some people, they may not be able to attend the rally, but they can write letters in support. It depends on what they feel that the kuleana is and what they can handle mentally, physically, and spiritually at that time.
Definitely. It's great points that you brought out right there. And one thing that one of the things that we admire about your work is that you seek balance viewpoints. As a Kanaka, you are not afraid to call out the imperfections within our community. For example, you have advocated for the Micronesian community within Hawaii and called out our local communities for their prejudices against our cousins. How have the community on both sides responded to that?
Micronesians are generally supportive. I get messages from Micronesians thanking me, and I feel awkward with that sometimes. I appreciate it, but I also
Yeah.
feel awkward because I feel like I shouldn't have to be the one who is so vocal about these
Mhm.
issues. I feel like as a Pacific Islander community, as an indigenous community, as someone who was, as a people that were also affected by American colonization,
Yes.
we should be more supportive.
Yes.
It should
Yes.
be a no-brainer,
Mhm.
Yes.
but it's not. And I don't know. There's a fear of brownness with the Micronesians. I don't know. I mean by that there is issues of colorism
Mhm.
within our community. Because I also see the way that some people in our community, and this is not to bash our community, I want to state that every community has issues.
Absolutely.
But even in how we deal with our Black
Mhm.
brothers and sisters,
Yeah.
s- like in the recent Black Lives Matter movement, there were times where I just was shaking my head, and because again, I see, so I don't particularly advocate for just sovereignty.
Mhm.
I actually believe strongly in liberation, and I believe that liberation is a collective
Yes.
matter. As long as if we have oppressed people, as long as if there are inequalities
Mhm.
within our own society and within
Yes.
our neighbors, within the world,
Right.
we need to tear them down.
Yeah, I love that because we were just talking about this on another panel in terms of like unifying cross cultures and breaking down the systems essentially of white supremacy and colonialization because we're all experiencing the same effects and traumas of it. And I'm also glad that you brought up the colorism thing because I have seen that within even my own family, sadly. Like, and I think it's because we've lost so much, whether it be culturally or even our own self identity and what our ancestors look like. Like, how, to me, criticizing or discriminating against Popolo, Black people, African Americans, to me, it's doing the same thing to our kupuna because we have roots in that too. So I'm so glad that you brought up those issues. It's doing all the things that we do. We've heard that the colorism aspect being a huge part of not just the general conversation, but experiences amongst those within our community as well.
Mhm.
I don't know if you consider yourself an activist, but I feel like you are because you speak out for so many communities, not just the native Hawaiian community, but like Austronesian communities. And as you mentioned, like around the world, regardless of where we are. So, but doing this work, it can be exhausting, right? Especially like in this era is what I'm trying to say. Era of social media where like people are constantly like commenting and spewing whatever it might be, whether it's good, bad, indifferent, whatever.
Yeah.
But you have weathered the storms with strength and grace. How do you recharge to continue your important work and not get just overwhelmed by everything?
Yeah.
Well, emotionally, to be perfectly honest, what brings me is having to argue with people from my own community. Like I can handle white supremacists and stuff like that. Like I've gotten death threats from the proud voice,
Hmm.
like that before. I can handle that. What I don't like is having to argue with another Hawaiian, especially when their viewpoint is centered on white supremacist points. And there was a period of time when I read through some of the Hawaii News Now comments or Civil Beat comments, some comments made by Hawaiian sounding names sound exactly like white supremacist talking points. Just replace Micronesian with black or replace black like with the Lindani shooting. Yeah, so that drains me a lot. And I've just learned, to be honest, I don't really post anymore to educate the general population. I post to help reaffirm and recharge people who are actually thinking about these issues.
Hmm.
Because the truth of the matter is, especially in social media, most times you will not be able to change someone's mind. So there's no real point to having a debate on social media. But there's a lot of people who are thinking about these issues or are thinking that they are voice alone in the wilderness.
Hmm.
And I like to point out these issues so that way people know that they're not alone in their thinking and that there is a community or there are voices in the community that resound in a similar way to their own.
And mahalo for being that voice because I know it has definitely reached my wilderness. And I'm actually glad that you brought up the point about having to have arguments within your own community. I've noticed that not just within Hawaiian, within other communities of color. And my husband and I talk about this a lot. But what triggered in my mind when you said that was like the struggle I sometimes have because I am not many Hawaiians would travel away from home so far, like by themselves without a family, right? I traveled up to the East Coast when I was young. And so my experiences have broadened, right? And I've seen more things. And sometimes when I've had conversations with friends back home, it's really hard to get them out of their, and I'm not knocking them, but like somewhat of a sheltered mindset in because they only see like what is around them, right? And the experience that they don't know what it's like to be a Hawaiian out in by yourself, like on your own paddling by yourself, right?
Yes.
And so yeah, it's definitely challenging to help them see like a different mindset too.
Yeah.
I think it's also important to remember that at the time of the overthrow, we had 70 newspapers, and literacy was basically universal. Actually, Hawaii and Scotland were the
Yes.
only two places in the world that had universal literacy. Today, literacy in Hawaii, I think, is at 83%. In terms of American school systems,
Hmm.
ranked 48, I think, out of
Hmm.
51.
Hmm.
There has been a great loss of education and intellectual inquiry that came with American colonization.
Yeah.
We were smarter, our ancestors were actually smarter than us in some
Hmm.
cases. When you read Hawaiian language newspapers, Hawaiians in South Africa talking about life there, Hawaiians in the Marquesas talking about life there. There's letters from Hawaiians in Manila and in London and in Rome talking about life there. Hawaiians were intellectually curious in the 19th century. Yes. And most of them were bilingual. And for Americans, being bilingual is seen as a dirty thing unless you're rich. But for most of the world, being bilingual and being open to looking at other ways of life is considered to be a good thing.
Hmm.
But in the US, it's not, because America is number one. We have to look at the chaos that was created last year with the coronavirus. There was such a lack of basic health education,
Hmm.
and that stems from defunding the public school system for the last 30 years. And in our cases, in Hawaii, comes from the fact that we're basically a colony and our education system is only to support the tourism industry.
Yes. Amazing
Yes.
points.
Yes.
we could we could go down a whole panel on that.
Another beauty of your research, and you cover indigenous people and cultures from all over the world, not just Hawaii. Have you discovered a connection between the Caribbean island cultures and the Pacific island cultures?
That's a very good question. Uh, this is a problem with documentation,
Mhm.
and this is where oral history needs to come up because of the fact. So, like for example, with people from I forgot the English name for it, Cape Verde. Yeah, I was thinking about the
Uh,
Portuguese name. There was a lot of Cape Verdeans in Hawaii in the 1830s and 40s.
Mhm.
We don't know who they are
Yes.
because they were not documented.
Mhm.
Because they were Portuguese citizens of color, so they didn't really matter. I
mm,
know that there was also Haitians in Hawaii, the 1930s as well, because there was also a lot of Haitian sailors.
Yes.
And I know that the events of there's also, of course, the Puerto Rican migration or
yes.
immigration to Hawaii. But
Yes.
then again, because they were a colony and they were people of color, we don't have a lot of documentation on the names of those people that arrived.
Mhm.
And this is like a problem with having a white focus history, is
Yes.
that it's
Mm-mm.
white focused. So we don't know these people. You don't
Yes.
know their stories a lot of times unless some white person wrote it. And I wish that actually there were more people of color writing about history
Yes.
and doing more oral histories because that's the only way we're going to be able to dig up these types of mo'olelo, these types of stories.
Mhm. Yeah.
And for example, with the Black community, there's a thinking with many Hawaiians that the Black community is something that is recent, that came about through the military. And that's because today, most of the Black community in Hawaii, where 85% are military related.
Mm-hmm.
That's today's community.
Right.
Mhm.
That's not the Black community that historically has been in Hawaii
Right.
Yes.
since the time of Kamehameha the First.
Mm.
There's been a Black community in Hawaii for the last 200 years.
Yeah.
We
Mm-hmm.
have to also recognize that as well. In fact, the Black community in Hawaii in the 18th in the early part of the 20th century was located near Kakaako, where there's now luxury condos. So there's that whole erasure of all of these histories. And like for
Yeah.
me, Hawaiian history is the history of Hawaiians, of course. But there's also a Hawaii history, which is the history of all of these people, diverse communities coming to Hawaii and sharing their culture in Hawaii, as well as unfortunately sharing oppression as well,
Yeah.
because of especially the sugar plantations, which is a very horrible history that I think we sanitize way too much
Yes.
because they were basically slaves. And they
Yes.
modeled the sugar plantations after cotton plantations. So we're celebrating, like when we talk about immigration, the history of these immigrant groups, like 1907, Filipinos arrived. We failed to mention that we're actually celebrating labor trafficking.
Yes. Yes.
So yeah, but that's again something that comes from our American education, just like how we celebrate Martin Luther King Day, as if that's the end of the Black Civil Rights movement.
Yeah.
Right.
We celebrate movements because we want them to end. That's
Mhm.
American mentality.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up that it was essentially akin to slavery. Because what I was gonna ask you is, sure you know this, but I'm gonna ask anyway. In terms of blackbirding, blackbirding is something I didn't know about until I would say a couple years ago, and I was like, "What is that?" And it was essentially the Polynesian slave trade. So
Mhm.
when we talk about the way I look at it is I try to like look at the dates and try to see like, okay, this is what was happening here, but what is the global perspective of the other events that were going on, which can explain like diversity of our that we've seen like throughout our history. So that's not just the military one, right? Like
Yeah.
that these people have been here forever. Well, not forever, but for a very long time, right? It's not a new thing. How much have you researched blackbirding and that effect on the Pacific Islander community?
So blackbirding wasn't necessarily Polynesian slave trading. It was Pacifica. And actually the worst impacted places were in Melanesia and
Mhm,
in Micronesia. The term Kanak or Kanaka in Australia today still refers to Pacific Islanders who were blackbirding
mhm,
because they couldn't think of another word. The name Kanaki for New Caledonia comes from the Hawaiian word Kanaka
mhm.
because, again, of the blackbirding experience. That was the only name as Pacific Islanders they were known by. So they adopted it as their name of their whole country. There are certain things within Hawaiian history, there are certain things within history that if I research too long about it, it actually gives me nightmares.
Yeah.
Some of that is like, for example, the Japanese occupation of China, like the rape of Nanking.
Mhm.
Horrible histories. Blackbirding and the Atlantic slave trade are two other histories,
Yes.
are horrible histories. But we need to talk about these horrible histories because they fed into institutions that we still have today. So,
Yes.
with blackbirding, birding actually began at the same time that the British had banned slavery in their other colonies, but they banned it in Africa. So Australia, which was an emerging colony, and mostly Australia, and other plantations within Tahiti and Hawaii. We also engaged in blackbirding in Hawaii. So there's these blackbirders. They're called blackbirders because well, the first enslaved people were from Melanesia, actually from Solomon Island, Vanuatu, that area. And they were called blackbirds because to call them humans would be to humanize them. So they called these humans blackbirds. The ones who enslaved the blackbirds were blackbirders. Again, horrible history.
Mm.
So they began scooping up from Fiji, from Vanuatu, from Solomon Islands, and then they also moved into Samoa, parts of Outer Tonga. They moved into also Micronesia. For example, in Koshrai, a lot of the women were birded. And by the time that Hawaiian missionaries arrived in Koshrai, which is in Micronesia, there was less than 500 Koshraians left on the island out of a population. I think the pre-contact population was 10,000. We don't know the numbers of all these people that were enslaved. And yeah, and Hawaii, we also had our share of plantations buying birds from these birders illicitly because they could not legally do that because slavery was banned in Hawaii, but they did it anyway. And from our case in Hawaii, we stole people, the sugar plantation stole people, mostly from Micronesia. And we don't know their names again because this was an illicit trade. But we know in cases like in Australia, and especially in Australia, which is more documented, these were several thousand. And there's a story about a Samoan village that the people slept. And while the people were sleeping, these blackbirders raided and stole the entire village. That also happened in parts of what was then called the Gilbert Islands, which is known today as Kiribati. And the horror of that. And the other thing we need to remember is that the blackbirding was slavery. It was labor trafficking, but it was also sex trafficking because some of these women were sold into brothels or sold as sex slaves. And that's also another history that we need to also talk about. Some of these women, these Pacific Islander women, actually were sold into brothels in the United States, in the Wild West, in Mexico, and also in China as well. And that's why sometimes when people do their DNA tests, they have this random Pacific Islander blood DNA. And that's because sometimes there's was an ancestor who was blackbirded and they wound up there, being sold over there. And Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, most of their population was birded to Peru and to Chile to work in mines, and many of them died. So imagine being in a community where one hand you're facing introduced foreign diseases,
Yes.
then on the other hand, you're also facing being kidnapped in the middle of the night and sold and working being forced to work yourself to death.
Yeah, like I read, I can't remember which book it was, it's behind me somewhere, but the ones who were kidnapped from Rapa Nui and forced to work in those mines, like they didn't even live like 6 months from when they hit the shore. Like it was just heartbreaking when I read these stories. But I'm glad that we're able to bring them to light. Perhaps when I'll do some mini series on that book. But it's essentially like it's written by a white person, but it was like the letters you know, captured by, I think it was the captain on a ship that was involved in the trafficking. But like reading, it's obviously written in his point of view. But when I'm reading it myself, I have centered on the indigenous experience within this thing. And I'm just like, it's unbelievable, really.
Yes.
So mahalo for sharing. I know it's a heavy topic and we have to end on that heavy topic. But yeah, just mahalo for sharing that because I feel like that's something that we should be talking about more, especially that our own community needs to be educated upon because a lot of the, mm, I guess, the perspectives that, like you said, were centered in white supremacist views or talking points, they also need to understand that like they have ancestors and people who are treated very much the same way. So for you to treat or people that you don't know just because of their skin color, to me, it's like spitting on your own ancestors. So yeah, I don't know what else to say about that, but I know I love my ancestors and I will do everything that I can to honor them. So mahalo. So let's end it on a good note. Tell us one thing that you are super proud of about Hawaii today and the progress that we're making in these different areas, and what encourages you about our future?
Sorry, I have to. I really have to think about that.
No, it's okay.
Like, because I think one of the things that is encouraging in terms of trends in Hawaii is that more and more Native Hawaiians are getting college degrees,
Yes.
well educated, and see more youth also speaking out against injustices and getting more familiar with issues such
Mm,
as Black Lives Matter, with the anti-Micronesian discrimination and things like that. So that's encouraging that the youth are taking more of a mantle of leadership. And I
yes.
hope that they don't get corrupted.
Yeah, right. Let us protect them, please.
But yes, and also the fact that more Hawaiians are getting the pala pala
Yes.
degrees. So that's good.
That's awesome. I'm glad you touched on that because I was talking on a panel inside my organization and sharing that like my mother was the first person of our family to get her degree. And my sister and I were the second and the third. So we're super proud to be like part of the ones who are trying to expand and lift up our statistics, which are not always great, and just trying to create spaces and opportunities for the youth to continue to do that. So mahalo nui for that. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing with us. I absolutely know that we are going to have you back. I would love to whenever,
Yes.
hopefully you have time in our upcoming panels or having another follow-on interview and we can talk about specific issues. But for those who may not even know like where to find you and your wealth of information, where's the best place for them to find you online?
Yes.
The best place would be right now. So I have a website, Keawe.com. That's one. But those are like my older blog entries. For newer stuff, IG would be at the place. And my IG handle is Adam Keawe. That's also my Twitter handle, but Twitter is more my political stuff, not so much history. And then there's also Facebook, but to be honest, I'm trying to phase out my Facebook. So yeah, there's that.
Okay, right on.
Mhm.
Yes, guys, definitely check out his Twitter, absolutely. And yeah, his Instagram is great too. I repost some of his things, not nearly as much as I need to, but definitely check out Keawe.
Yes.
We are blessed and honored to have your mana'o and your bravery as part of our community. So thank you so much. Thank you for tuning in and listening, whether you're live or on the replay. Please be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube and on Twitch. Mahalo nui, everyone. We hope that you all enjoyed. Take care, be good to one another, and we will see you